Channel. I have got so many articles to get through. I would love to do another comments video at some point, but it will take some time just because I've got so many articles to get through. But I think in the meantime I'll just reply to your comments in the chat if that's okay. And I will do a comments video as soon as I can, where I talk about my video, but in the meantime I'll just comment on, in the box where I can. It's just because I've got a massive backlog and a log of articles to get through, and there are just so many new articles that keep coming across. I'm thinking, wow, that's interesting, I need to do a video on that, and they just keep on building up. Just briefly, before I get on to the article I want to discuss, I did watch recently A Kind of Spark, which was a BBC drama. It was on BBC iPlayer, CBBC I think, but I watched it on iPlayer, based upon a children's novella of the same name, about an autistic young girl called Addie who became very interested in the witch trials in her hometown of Juniper many years. Obviously the witch trials going back, right back to the 16th century. And also the idea that many autistic women might have been persecuted, and actually this will probably take a whole other video, so I think I will actually do another video on this because I want to focus on an article today. But I just wanted to let you know I have watched that, and if any of other of you have watched it, let me know. I think I'll do a proper video on that at some point. Well, hopefully not before too long, because while it's still fresh in my mind, but I've got so many other things to talk about as well, just trying to organise everything. But yeah, I did watch it and it was okay, but I'll come back and talk about it another time. Because in today's video, I wanted to talk about an article called "Is Autism Overdiagnosed? The Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, Journal of Child Psychology, April 2023. Okay, so I've talked about this quite a lot in my channel before, about the issues of diagnosis and stuff, and I take a very critical line about this, because I do think it is inevitable that when there's no blood test and no official biomedical test for a condition, there will be false positives. That is kind of, that's inevitable. And also, you've got to remember that the condition of autism, just as much as any other psychiatric condition, is a construct. By that, I do not mean it's not real, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about it in a sort of postmodern sense of it not being real and it's like all a construct, not that sort of thing. I simply mean that at a given point of time in history, psychiatrists noticed, a pattern of behaviours and symptoms in children, because at the time it was, it was seen as a childhood thing. Obviously now we know it affects adults as well, and it's not just a childhood thing, and you grow up with it and everything. But yeah, they noticed a pattern of behaviours, and then they grouped those behaviours together into kind of constellations and formulated a diagnosis, because they noticed a pattern of children with similar symptoms, and where these symptoms occur together, more often than maybe you'd expect by chance, and over time this pattern develops and they eventually create a diagnosis. But it is quite arbitrary, because how many of the symptoms does a child need to have the diagnosis? At what intensity do those symptoms need to be? How severe do they need to be? How much disruption do they need to create? That relies on clinical judgment. And over time, the diagnosis has changed. It's widened. It's included greater and greater numbers of children and adults. To the point, some would argue, has it actually overreached itself? Do we actually now need to create new categories? Is it too big? And that's a big philosophical discussion. So the question of overdiagnosis, some people might think that's a taboo topic, that we shouldn't be talking about it, but I think we do need to talk about it, because it is a worthwhile conversation, because we cannot avoid the fact that this is an issue, philosophically speaking. And my own line is that actually diagnosis is really important, and people should be diagnosed with a condition that best meets their profile, and everyone should get the support they need, and that services are underfunded and need way more funding. Diagnosis should be a lot better, a lot more funded, and all of that. I'm all for diagnosis, but I do think that diagnosis needs to be done properly, and I do think, controversially maybe, that some conditions are overdiagnosed. But I'm not going to go in too much into my own personal views on this because I want to cover the article. So this article, which I thought was quite interesting, is talking about back in the 1960s, when a lot of psychiatric conditions were first being kind of mapped out. It came to clinicians' attention that there was a poor reliability of psychiatric diagnoses, and that this poor reliability of psychiatric diagnoses could be driven by several different factors, including information variance. For example, how clinicians go about inquiring about symptoms, interpretation variance, how they weigh observed symptoms towards diagnostic formulations. And they're just some of them. So these issues were identified in the 1960s, and out of that, diagnostic instruments were subsequently developed to standardise the way that symptoms are elicited, evaluated and scored. Because prior to that, it was very much on a diagnostician sort of whim, like there wasn't any standardisation of diagnoses. Standardisation came along later, and that was very important to ensure reliability, replicability across different settings. So it standardised the way symptoms were listed, evaluated and scored, and diagnostic criteria were introduced in 1980 for autism. In 1980, autism entered the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders for the first time. Prior to 1980, it was not autism, it was childhood psychosis, I think. But under autism, because autism previously was known as childhood psychosis, but in 1980, autism officially entered the DSM as autism for the first time, with a kind of and proper criteria was developed. Still no Asperger's at this point, by the way. That wasn't until 1994. So in order to ensure diagnostic sort of accuracy or validity, I should say, it's very important for the diagnostician to rely on multiple informants and data sources. So it would not be good practice just to rely on one person's evidence, even if that person is the person thinking they might have a condition. It's not good practice. That is not a scientific way of forming a judgment. You shouldn't, if you think about it, a diagnostic process is basically scientific, isn't it? The clinician is basically like a scientist, and no scientist just looks at one source of evidence. No historian looks at one source of evidence either. In many ways, science and historians and scientists actually employ quite similar techniques to weigh up evidence, and both historians and scientists. In actual fact, a clinician is both a scientist and a historian. They have to go back in time, they have to form a kind of timeline, and they have to weigh up the evidence, and that involves critical skills, and not just any old person has these critical skills. They have to take into account more than one informants, so rely on multiple informants and data sources, evaluate the situational specificity or the pervasiveness of behaviours. So, are the behaviours just specific to one context, or do they occur across contexts? And also to assess functional impairment beyond merely taking symptom inventories. So it's a process, it's not just a tick box. And it requires a process, not just test results. Okay, I'm going to move over to video number 2 now, just to carry on talking about the issues around diagnosis and how maybe this could potentially have done incorrectly, could result in false positives. Obviously, there's also dangers of underdiagnosis as well, false negatives and false positives if it's not done correctly. Okay, so moving over to video number 2 now.